is Shilo Shiv Suleman, and I often say that beauty saved me because at a moment of tremendous fear in my own life, beauty became into both the emotional backbone as well as the financial backbone of my family. I grew up actually quite a dream child. Like there was no end to my imagination when I was growing up, and when I was a child. I went to a school with 140 acres of land and not a single computer on campus. And at some point, though, life became very real and the fears became very real. When my dad said that he was going for a business trip to China and didn't come back for over a decade. And my mother found herself responsible for two kids with no real career, no financial, no financial plan in place. And she, at that point, had a hobby as a cartographer. So she'd studied cartography, she'd studied map making, and she used to make these Columbus era maps and recreate these Columbus era maps. So she realized that she could paint, and so she began to teach art during the day, and I would go and teach art with her at all of 14 years old, like carrying her basket of crayons with her to different art classes that she would do. And at night we would come back home and we would paint. And again, I was 14 at that point, so at the height of my teenage angst, having just also encountered a pretty intense traumatic experience in our own life. And back then, both of our paintings were not the way they are anymore. My mother, Shilo Shiv Suleman, continues to be an artist and is an incredible legend in the art world. But back then, our paintings were full of a lot of pain, full of a lot of abandonment, full of a lot of angst. But what we realized was that the marvelous thing about any emotion, including pain, is that the more you let it out of your system, the more you allow for it to transform. And so I often say, we did transform, we shape-shifted, cocoon to chrysalis, mineral to mountain. We lifted ourselves out of the murky waters like straight-spined lotus flowers. And we almost painted a reality that we could then step into. So as me and my mother, taught art by day and painted by night, at some point our work began to transform in very profound ways as well, because once the pain had been let out of our system, there was space for something new to emerge. And we realized that we could fill that vacuum with what we wanted rather than what we didn't want in our lives. So she continued painting these incredible, sort of miniature universes of India in her canvases. So at that point, I started really understand my relationship with India and my relationship with myself. I was painting a lot of self-portraits even back then, and I continue to paint a self-portrait every year as a way to, I guess, almost open up an intimate conversation with my own interior world. And as I was traveling across the country, I was, painting these hand-bound journals, traveling across Rajasthan, traveling into the mountains, making portraits of people that I would meet along the way. I realized that because I could tell my own story, I also had the capacity to tell other people's stories with them and for them. And again, kind of a total sort of child of this generation, even though my work was on some level limited to these hand-bound, beautiful journals that I was carrying around the country in trains and in buses, I was also putting a lot of it online. And so I had a blog, my blog started to pick up a little bit. And around the time that I was 18 years old, me and my mother went to Bombay with a catalog of her paintings that I had made for her on Microsoft Word. I was kind of acting as like her manager back then. And we went from gallery to gallery asking if she could do a show. We went to all of the big galleries in Bombay, and everyone, of course, said no, like looking at this almost J.K. Rowling kind of character, single mom with her 18-year-old manager daughter. And eventually one of the gallerists that we met there, Art Musings, at first they also said no, and then they called her back and they said, yes, let's do a show together. And Nilofar's work has been sold out ever since. Her first show was a tremendous success. And at the same time, me having my blog online, my blog started to get picked up, started to kind of harness this popularity. And I started to illustrate children's books by the time I was 16, 17 years old. By the time I was 18, had 10 published books in the market. And then started to kind of wander into seeing how I could bring the magic, the imagination, the healing, the beauty that I had found in the world of art to other spaces that felt like they needed to have that kind of intervention. So again, going to a school with 140 acres of land and not a computer on campus, of course, technology was something that was both fascinating as well as forbidden in my upbringing. And at that point, there was this huge buzz around, the iPad and new media storytelling for kids, and how it was going to be the next frontier for a kind of global storytelling. And what I realized was that even though when I went to bazaars in India, a bazaar in the north would be completely different from a bazaar in, say, Tamil Nadu. And the digital bazaar somehow made everything completely devoid of culture, devoid of magic. It felt like everything that I saw on that new frontier was like Goldilocks and all of these stories that didn't really fit into our consciousness at all. And so I started to think about how I could create a very intentional intervention in new media spaces, where technology could be used as a platform for culture and also bring people closer to nature, rather than separate us from it. So again, at all of like 20, I began working on a series of new media narratives for kids. A lot of, again, this was at a point when not only the iPad, but a lot of the technologies that we find quite daily these days were very new. Like augmented reality was something that people were just starting to discover and starting to play with. And so with a lot of my experiments, especially at university at that point, it was about seeing how I could use things like augmented reality, the mobility of mobile devices, to get kids in particular out into the natural world again, to create stories that were culturally rooted in India and Indianness, but were not retelling the same, Mahabharata and Ramayana over and over again. They were contemporary Indian narratives that were drawing from our culture, were drawing from our mythology, but creating something anew. So I began to work on a series of new media narratives for kids, called Khoya, and things sort of, again, flowered in a sense, bloomed when I was chosen as part of an Ink Fellowship program. So that was 20 young people who were doing exciting, innovative work in their own fields, and was the only artist who was chosen in that year in particular, which led to then a TED Talk, which got just under 1 million views. And it felt like very similar to how it was with my mom as well. Like overnight, it really felt like something had shifted in a very radical way, and continues to shift every day since. So the TED Talk was definitely a catalyst for my growth. I remember like being online as it went up at 21 years old, and within the first like 10 minutes seeing like 100,000 views, and then 200,000 views, 300,000 views. My inbox was flooded. My Facebook at that point was completely flooded, and that really began for me kind of a very beautiful journey in traveling across the world, going and representing India and Indian technology at spaces like the Wired conference in the UK, DLD in Munich, and also being a woman, also being a young Indian woman, sitting amongst a lot of men who were interested in technology and had all of these very practical, functional, new media tech startups. And then here was my project, which brought a lot of wonder. It brought culture, it brought nature back into technology. So that went on for a few years. We were working on developing it as a series. We started to raise funding for the rest of the series. And again, with a great deal of, Steve Wozniak, the founder of Apple, ended up reviewing it. So there was a lot of energy that was being generated, a lot of success that was being generated around that when the Nirbhaya case happened in 2012. So I happened to be in Delhi at that time, and went out onto the streets at the protest, and it was the first protest that I ever attended. And it was insane. It was just like, there was so much rage on the streets, but also as, in between the breaks where women had their hands up in protest, we would sit on the pavements. And as we were sitting on the pavements, we would tell each other our stories of abuse, of fear of violence, of sexual violence in public spaces, or even in our own intimate spaces. And I realized that while all of that technology and all of the dreams of the future needed to exist, simultaneously we couldn't actually actualize or realize the future if we didn't deal with the pain of the present and the pain of our past. And so I returned to the most basic technology that I knew, which was my body on the streets with a brush in my hand. Um, and the Fearless Collective began in 2012, quite by accident. What I found while I was at the protest was, again, while there was all this nuance in the way that we were telling each other our stories, it felt almost as if people who were coming to those protests, of course, were mourning the death of Jyoti Singh Pandey, but were also bringing their own wounds with them. And as we revealed our wounds to each other, we were doing it in such a gentle, nuanced way, like flowers, opening themselves up to the light for the first time. And as we were telling each other our stories, we were healing, just in telling those stories. But a lot of the mainstream narratives that we were hearing at the time, don't go out because you'll get raped, don't attract attention to yourself because you'll get raped, 5-year-old raped, like all of the fear that was being generated by mainstream media and storytelling felt really counterproductive to the shift that we actually needed to see. Simultaneously, at the protest itself, a lot of the imagery, like the visual imagery that we were seeing, was extremely violent. We were seeing images of, silhouetted women, like with hands covering their faces, or being attacked on the streets. A lot of the spells, the slogans that we were hearing in public space were all like "hang the rapist." There was "stop violence against women." There was so much violence just and in the imagery and in the language that we were using at the protest, that it felt like that was also counterproductive and very unlike what I was seeing in the nuance of women telling each other their own stories. Because telling someone your story is not just a report, it's not reportage, it's also alchemy. It has the potential to be able to transform us. And especially having experienced a lot of fear and using art and storytelling to be able to find a bridge to another space, like for me, it felt quite close to home that stories needed to be used as a way to be able to alchemize, to transform our realities. We need artists to be able to create visions of what can exist, because very often our protest movements stand in opposition to something, but they don't stand in affirmation to what we do want. We know what we hate, but we don't know what we love with as much articulation and clarity. And this continues to be the case, right? Like even during the CA and RC protests, a lot of the slogans on the street were no CA and RC, but we also simultaneously needed a resurgence of a diverse identity in India. Or right now with what's happening in Sri Lanka, we were very Fearless is very closely involved in that as well. A lot of the protests were about, go home, Gota, and now that the Rajapaksa government has fallen, now what? What do we want as much as we know what we don't want? So Fearless began as a flood. I put out a poster, which was an image, an affirmation of, I guess, a feminine identity, a fearless identity. And before I knew it, I had hundreds of posters flooding in from across the country of women who had experienced sexual violence, who were telling their own stories, who were surviving despite of what they had gone through, who were articulating their healing, who were breaking their silence, but were also healing beyond breaking their silence. It's not enough to just break the silence. It's also important to know what exists on the other side of that. Like, how does one actually heal? How does one repatriate? How does one move beyond the pain, right? And so it was like this amazing flood of affirmations of existence, and they were women representing their own stories. And what was also quite exciting about that campaign early on was that even though it was accidental on some level, at the same time, it was always intentionally open source. So the posters that went online, and again, this is, now we're talking 10 years ago, where even online advocacy and any kind of social media campaigning was quite new at that point. But these posters were online and available, and people were printing them out across the world and putting them up onto the streets. And it's when we saw them on the streets that I really felt like there was a power in this, because the images of women that we see on the streets are either selling you like something in an ad, where it's like a kitchen sink or an apartment is being sold to you through a woman's body, or you see images of politicians or Bollywood stars or people in power, but you don't see images of Indian women or women at all, who are just existing, who are claiming, who are playing, who are healing, who are living in public spaces. So just to see these images kind of go up, be pasted up onto the streets of Indian women in a country with hundreds of languages, this visual language kind of became into a very interesting point of discussion, point of articulation, and point of dialogue. So it really felt like, even though the digital media campaign was very exciting, there was a potentiality in it actually being out onto the streets, and that's where it needed to exist. I then started to paint murals with different communities. At first, it was me going to different spaces and painting murals with those community members, or of those community members, and then slowly it became into a more participative methodology, where now we do immersive workshops on healing, on trauma and art-based therapy with different communities who have been invisibilized or marginalized in some way, communities of women in particular. And we make these huge public monuments of them, like completely the same way that monuments exist to our prime ministers, our kings, our stars. We make huge monuments to the Dalit community, monuments to sex workers, to transgender people, to LGBTQ people all across the world. So Fearless continues to exist, and simultaneously my work with art and technology also continues to exist. That we do carry our own lineages, sometimes chosen, sometimes inherited. And I think as a female artist, undoubtedly people like Amrita Shergill, people like Frida Kahlo have been tremendous influences. Yeah, I would also say that poets like Akka Mahadevi, like Andal, Lalla, all of these women who made art despite what society told them that they had to be or who they had to be. And that's also kind of a foundation to how we operate within the Fearless methodology. Is very often as women we're told who we should be, and we don't get the opportunity to articulate who we want to be. And so with a lot of our work, be it whether we're working with a group of domestic migrant workers in Lebanon on the border of Syria, or if we're working with indigenous communities, we use art to be able to shift from who we're told to be to who we want to become. For me as well, self-portraiture was a very, again, it's interesting because there is a lineage with Amrita Shergill and Frida, where they did paint self-portraits. With Frida, her self-portraits pointed at the pain inside of her body, and were very much like making that pain visible, which for that particular generation, I think was very radical in its own way, because women were never given the chance to make their pain visible. So much of it was swallowed inside of their bodies. And so for her to paint herself with, tears with Diego's face inside of it, or a crown of thorns around her neck, like by making her pain visible, she was doing something quite radical for that generation of women. For Amrita, it was really a reclamation of her own, of Orientalism. Like there were all of these at that point portrait painters who would paint portraits of exotic Oriental women, and for her to claim that as being part Indian herself, and to reclaim that was a very radical act. And for me, I see self-portraiture as absolute healing, but not just about making my pain visible, not just about exoticizing myself, but actually using it as a tool to be able to shift my own internal state. And like I said, in the beginning, when I was painting self-portraits, they were quite dark. And then at some point, the darkness left my body, and there was a space to be able to fill that vacuum with who I wanted to be. And every time I would paint a self-portrait, it really allowed me to actually kind of create a vision of where I wanted to be, so that I could eventually go there. And if we don't have those visions of who we want to be, then it becomes hard to move. So even when we work with our communities, we always say that sometimes the images that we paint are portals to a future that doesn't even exist yet. Like, can a group of domestic migrant workers, like we painted an image of 3 domestic migrant workers lying down in a park in Beirut, drinking tea. And does that exist? It doesn't. But one day it will, because we've seen it. So now we can't unsee it. We painted images of indigenous communities completely sovereign, like kings and queens of the nation on the streets of Glasgow during COP26. Is that a reality that exists? No, but one day it can be. And just by simply having the vision of it, we create a blueprint of the future that we can inhabit, that we can claim. So yeah, I would definitely say that there is a lineage there with the Frida, the Amrita, the Lalla, the Akka Mahadevi, who transgressed boundaries that were set upon them by society and used art as a way to be able to create a future that now we can all inherit. I guess, I don't know. In a way, I think as an artist, the idea of success or failure, even though there has been both, it doesn't feel as daunting because the process is as much a part of the outcome as the outcome is. So it's, for me, it's less about an end goal. It's about the journey. It's not about the outcome in a big way. As I'm painting, as I'm creating my work, I'm as fulfilled or as successful as I am if I sell it or if I receive an accolade for it. And I really appreciate that about the arts in general, is that it's so embodied. It's not something that's separate from, it's not a goal, it's not a business plan, it's not a 5-year plan, it's not a 3-year plan. It is actually an embodied day-to-day fulfillment and success. So I think there's one part of that. At the same time, I would say in terms of what are goals for me right now, I think, like I said, my life continued to exist as a parallel universe, where on one hand, I am with Fearless Collective, which is now growing into a movement of hundreds of artists across South Asia who need to go out into public spaces, who are at the front lines of movements, be it Shaheen Bagh, be it what's happening in Sri Lanka, be it women's rights movements in Pakistan. So Fearless continues to exist as a way to be able to heal the present and envision a future. And simultaneously also with my work, I continue to activate and imagine what a cultural resurgent future could look like. So even though my work with technology and particularly with new media storytelling took a backseat after the Nirbhaya case, over the years, it started to re-emerge as something that I'm very passionate about. So I worked on a series of installations that were all biofeedback installations, one of which was at Burning Man in 2014 and then again in 2016. A lot of that work also came up because I fell in love with a neuroscientist, and while our relationship didn't work, we created a bunch of really interesting art together that would pull from the body and make the invisible parts of our body visible. So we were doing a lot of research around using brainwaves to be able to activate interactive art. And then we went to the heart and started to do a lot of research around biosynchronicity and how people, when human beings spend enough time with each other, their heart rates actually begin to beat in time with each other. And so we created an installation called Pulse and Bloom that was at Burning Man, where if one person put their hand on a flower, it would beat in time with their heart. But if two people put their hand on the same flower, you could see both projected heartbeats, and over time you could see how your heart rates do actually begin to synchronize. And so with a lot of the work that I continue to do with technology, it is about making that invisible world inside of us visible, but using the technology of the quantified self, like to be able to break down the idea of self completely, to be able to recognize that we are all connected, that we are part of a invisible ecosystem. When a teacher is teaching a class, the breath rates of all the students often synchronizes. So there are all of these invisible ways that we continue to be connected as natural human beings. And so for me, success, I think, is really about being able to realize my imagination, and make my imagination visible and make those realities, those worlds visible. Many moments where I felt there's a possibility for fear to transform into love. And those are exactly the moments that I think I live for and I do this work for. One of them was, I was in Pakistan, which was already, in a way, I guess, transgressing a boundary of fear into love. painting some of the first public murals, feminist murals that exist of women in Pakistan, because on the streets of Pakistan, there's a lot of jinnah, there's a lot of political propaganda, but at that point, there was no real public art movement. And it was a very precarious time to be there because one of our collaborators had just been shot and killed and assassinated for doing the activism that she did. It was the first time that an Indian woman artist standing on the streets, painting with, transgender sex workers in Rawalpindi and feminists in Lahore. And so it was a very interesting time to be there, and definitely came with a lot of fears in its own way. But we were painting in Liari, outside of Karachi. And Liari, when people hear that someone is from Liari, they say, okay, do you have a gun in your pocket? Because Liari is ridden with gang violence, to the point where it was kind of ostracized even by main Karachi and the government in Pakistan, because it was so violent that then it was impossible to work through sanitation, through any kind of development and infrastructure over there. So it was kind of the black sheep in a sense that was left behind. And we were painting in Liari with children who were trying to get out of the gangs, who were claiming some of those spaces, old torture homes, to be safe spaces again. It was, again, an interesting time to be there because, like I said, Sabine Mahmood had just been shot and killed in the streets. And so a lot of the artists who had joined us in Pakistan was also stepping out for the first time since then and going out into the streets. And as we were painting, on these abandoned kind of broken down buildings, at some point I remember turning around and seeing this military tanker park up behind us, and 12 military officers come and kind of circle me with guns in their hand. And they basically were like, we're here to, like, everybody froze for a second. We were like, why are these people here? And when we asked them why they were there, they said that they were here, they'd heard that there was an Indian artist painting and they were here to protect her. And at that point, the boys from Liari, from the gangs, kind of looked at the military guys and they were like, don't worry, we have it under control. And I looked up and I saw that on all the different rooftops behind me were different boys from the gang who were literally watching my back and making sure that I was safe. And so it's one of those situations where, you feel like you're painting in one of the most unsafe neighborhoods in Pakistan, which is already unsafe as an Indian citizen. And you realize that actually you are more cared for than you could even imagine. And there have been multiple moments like this across the years of doing fearless work where you walk in expecting a lot of fear and instead you receive a tremendous amount of transformative love. My vision for the future, I think I have visions for the future, more than one consolidated vision, but I'm sure it all feeds up together. So for me, one of the visions with Fearless is to actually imagine a world without fear. What does it look like, particularly as women, particularly as South Asian women, to be in the streets and not feel afraid? I think for me, that's a big part of what I would like to see is a fearless future. I think so many of our systems right now are based in fear, be it the way that we sign contracts or the way that we make or break relationships, the way that we travel, the way that we interact with our families. I think particularly in South Asia, fear is and scarcity is a big part of how we operate in the world. And I do know that the alternative exists, and the alternative is living, breathing, beating love. So for me, the way that vision manifests is, like I said, with the Fearless movement, we're seeing ourselves grow into now hundreds of women across South Asia who are reclaiming public spaces from fear, who are reclaiming their bodies from fear, who are making visions of this safe and sacred future that we want to inhabit, who are on the front lines of different movements across the world and across South Asia, believing in that safe and sacred future, but doing it by creating beauty. Because I believe that given all of the ugliness of the oppressions that we fight, the creation of beauty in itself is an act of resistance. So that's one of my visions for a fearless future. I have faith that our future will be fearless. Another vision that I have is, I think that in India, we are still grappling with and still understanding the deep deep-seated effects of colonization. I think that on a cultural level, on one hand, while we all talk about how the British gave us our railways or how globalization has helped the market in so many ways, at the same time, I think there was still a lot of deep-seated divisiveness, a lot of self-loathing that was left behind by the colonizers. And so I think I am also equally participating in a vision of a renaissance, a resurgence movement within India, where we are able to build upon the wildest dreams of our ancestors. I feel like when we think about the imagination of the Mughals, of the Cholas, of of all these empires before the British, there was a connection to the soil by simply through the medium of the material that we were using. Those temples in Jaisalmer have literally been carved out of that sandstone from there. And I feel like that was something, it almost feels like with colonization, it was like the roots of our tree was cut. And now that we have an opportunity to be able to regrow those roots, how much space can we take? They often say that also, like, with trees, the branches are what we see, but underneath that, there's an invisible web of roots that are actually the same width. There's a invisible forest underneath our forests. So for me, with a lot of the work that I'm doing in Jaipur right now in my studio in Hawa Mahal, it is really focusing on a kind of resurgence, on cultural perpetuity, on bringing together art, technology, craft in a way that is contemporary and is part of a global conversation without it being globalized in any way. I think what has happened as a result of colonization is also the way that we view tech, science, art, education, engineering. Like, we look at them in isolation, but if we look back, those silos didn't exist. If a painter was going to paint a beautiful miniature painting, they had to have intimate knowledge of the weather, because they would harvest their paints based on the seasons that those minerals or those flowers were available. Sometimes they also had to have a basic understanding of medicine, because sometimes those paints that they were harvesting to be able to paint could also be used as medicine, could turn into poison if not treated in the same way or in the right way. Or when I look back at the stepwells in India, there's a beautiful stepwell in Gujarat called Rani Ki Vav, which was built in the 17th century by a Solanki queen. It was made by a woman. That was a piece of technology. It was also, a piece of culture. It was a cultural point for people to gather, for women to gather in particular. It had an intimate knowledge of the geology of that land. It was actually harvesting water in very dry spaces. And it was a piece of art. So decolonizing my idea of art also means taking it away from gallery spaces and really bringing those spaces of art, technology, science, education together. And for me, that's a big part of my vision, is that we're able to create a contemporary identity for Indian art that is not separate from life, that is embedded in our love letters, in our utensils, in our weapons, on our walls, in our saris, in our technology, because art is not separate from life. Art is life. Art is the life made visible, life made possible. I think I live all of those visions of the future that I want to inhabit, in a sense. Like, I just got back from Ladakh, where I was dancing at the border of China while 5,000 army officers stared at us. And, in terms of, I think over the years, that's also the thing, is even though I came from a space of fear in my own life, what's beautiful about any vision or any affirmation is that at first it feels like it's very far away, but then slowly you start to step your way into that until there is no separation between who you are and who you want to be. So I'm definitely in that space right now where I feel like I'm living all of those radical imaginations. The first mural that I ever painted said, "What we worship, we shall become." And it was on the banks of the Ganga. And it was, at that point, I was very frustrated with a lot of the patriarchal ways that women were treated at the Kumbh Mela, which was also happening in 2012 during the same time as the Nirbhaya protests. And I felt like there was a huge division in the way that women were worshipped on our walls, were treated in our homes. And so when I wrote "What we worship, we shall become," it was like a reclamation for me of like not needing permission, not needing someone else to give me access, but for me to recognize my the divinity inside of me and to worship that completely. And I think over the years, even though again at that point I was 21 years old, very insecure, very full of fear at that moment, I think over the years I've definitely come to a place where I can say I am fearless. Yeah, but I do think that like right now, some of the visions are for the future for myself is just to be able to continue to be able to do this work. Yeah, I'm very grateful to have one foot in